The moment I realized my marriage was over, I was standing barefoot in the rain holding a suitcase that didn't belong to me. It was 11:47 on a Thursday night. The storm had arrived without warning. Rain hammered against the pavement. Thunder rolled across the Charlotte skyline. And I was supposed to be 700 miles away. I wasn't supposed to be home. In fact, my husband believed I was already in Chicago. That's what makes what happened next so terrifying. Because the two people inside my house had absolutely no idea I was standing outside listening. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The black Mercedes parked in my driveway. The unfamiliar suitcase sitting beside the front door. The lights glowing inside rooms that should have been empty. None of it made sense. Until I saw the second car, and my stomach dropped. Because I recognized it immediately. It belonged to my best friend, Rachel Morgan. The woman I had trusted for more than 20 years. The woman I called my sister. The woman who had stood beside me on my wedding day. The woman I would have trusted with my life. For a moment, I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Ethan was helping her. Maybe she had stopped by unexpectedly. Maybe there was some perfectly reasonable answer. But deep down, I already knew. Because women know. Sometimes our hearts refuse to accept what our instincts already understand. I slowly stepped onto the front porch. The rain soaked through my clothes. My hands trembled. Not from fear, from certainty. Then I heard them. Voices. Inside my house. Low. Careful. Deliberate. I couldn't make out every word. But I heard enough. And what I heard didn't sound like two people having an affair. It sounded like two people planning something. Something they didn't want me to know. I moved closer to the window. And that's when I saw it. 3 passports. 2 airline tickets. And more cash than I'd ever seen sitting on my own dining room table. My heart started pounding. Why would Ethan need passports? Why was Rachel there? Where were they going? And why did it look like they were preparing to disappear? Then, Rachel said something that made every hair on my body stand up. Once Candace signs the papers, everything belongs to us. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just cheating. It was something far bigger. And before this night was over, I would discover a secret capable of destroying every relationship in my life.
Good morning and welcome back to NeuroTales. I'm Finney. You know, one of the hardest lessons life can teach us is that betrayal rarely comes from strangers.
It comes from the people we trust, the people we invite into our homes, the people we celebrate birthdays with, the people we would never imagine hurting us. And sometimes, the people we love the most become the people capable of breaking us the deepest. Today's story is about trust. A trust built over decades. A friendship that seemed unbreakable. A marriage that appeared solid from the outside. And one rainy night that changed everything. Because Candace Harper thought she knew exactly who her husband was. But she was about to uncover a devastating secret. She thought she knew exactly who her best friend was. But sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden from us by enemies. They're hidden by the people sitting right beside us. What Candace overheard that night wasn't just shocking. It wasn't just heartbreaking. It revealed a plan so calculated, so deliberate, that it would force her to question whether the life she had been living was ever real at all. And trust me, what you've heard so far is only the beginning. There's so much more to this story. Before we continue, do well to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and clicking on the notification bell. And while you're here, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far the NeuroTales family reaches around the world. Now, grab your coffee, settle in. Let's dive into today's story.
And let's go back to the night Candace stood outside her own home in the rain, unaware that the two people she trusted most were about to change her life forever.
6 months before the storm. 6 months before the passports. 6 months before the inheritance documents. 6 months before Candace Harper found herself standing outside her own house in the rain, listening to a conversation she was never supposed to hear. She believed her life was exactly where it was supposed to be. Not perfect, but good, stable, secure. The kind of life people spend years trying to build. At 46 years old, Candace had everything she thought mattered most. A successful marriage, a beautiful home, lifelong friendships, and a future that seemed predictable in the best possible way. She didn't know it yet, but every single one of those things was already slipping through her fingers. Candace Harper wasn't the kind of woman who demanded attention when she entered a room. She never had been. She was warm without being loud, confident without being arrogant, the type of woman people naturally trusted. Friends often described her as dependable. Family members described her as generous, and strangers usually described her as kind. She worked as a senior administrative director for one of Charlotte's largest healthcare organizations, a career she has spent nearly 20 years building, not because she chased titles, because she believed in consistency, in showing up, in doing things the right way, every day. For 20 years, her office overlooked downtown Charlotte. From the large windows, she could see the skyline stretching across the horizon, a view she appreciated every morning, not because it impressed her, because it reminded her how far she'd come. The daughter of hardworking parents, the granddaughter of farmers, the woman who built a successful life without shortcuts, without connections, without luck. At least, that's what she believed. Her husband, Ethan Harper, was 48, tall, charismatic, naturally confident, the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 10 new friends, where Candace was reserved. Ethan was outgoing, where she was cautious. He was spontaneous. For most of their marriage, those differences had balanced each other beautifully. Together, they seemed complete. Friends often joked that they were the perfect team. Candace organized life. Ethan made life exciting. And for 15 years, that had been enough. Or at least, it appeared to be. Their home sat in one of Charlotte's most desirable suburban neighborhoods. A beautiful 2-story brick house surrounded by mature oak trees. The kind of neighborhood where children still rode bicycles, where neighbors waved from their driveways, where people felt safe, leaving their front doors unlocked. Candace loved that house, not because it was expensive, because it felt like home. Every room carried memories. Every hallway held a story. The dining room, where Ethan proposed. The kitchen, where they celebrated promotions. The living room, where they spent countless Christmas mornings. It wasn't luxury that made a house valuable. It was history. And history mattered to Candace more than money ever could. Then there was Rachel Morgan. Rachel had been part of Candace's life for 23 years. Long before Ethan entered the picture. Long before marriage. Long before careers. They met as young women sharing a tiny apartment while trying to establish themselves professionally. Back then, they had nothing. No savings. No security. No certainty about the future. Just ambition, hope, and each other. Over the years, they became inseparable. Rachel stood beside Candace during some of the most important moments of her life. She attended every birthday, every promotion, Every holiday gathering, every major milestone. When Candace married Ethan, Rachel stood beside her as maid of honor, crying almost as hard as Candace herself. At least that's what Candace believed. Looking back later, she would wonder how much of it had been real. The three of them became a familiar trio. Weekend dinners, holiday celebrations, summer cookouts, movie nights. Rachel practically had her own place at the house. She knew where everything was. The spare key, the coffee mugs, the guest room linens. No one questioned it. Why would they? Rachel was family, or so Candace thought. What Candace valued most wasn't money. It wasn't status. It wasn't success. It was trust. Trust was everything. The foundation beneath every relationship. The thing that made life feel safe. And nowhere was that trust more visible than in the inheritance left behind by her grandmother. The family property. Nearly 60 acres of land just outside Charlotte. Land that had belonged to her family for generations. The property wasn't worth millions yet, but developers had started showing interest. The city was expanding. Suburban growth was moving outward. Property values were climbing rapidly. Real estate experts estimated the land could eventually become extremely valuable. Candace didn't care. To her, it wasn't an investment. It was family. Her grandfather's fingerprints still seemed to exist on every fence post. Her grandmother's memories lived in every corner of the property. Selling it felt impossible, almost disrespectful. She intended to preserve it forever, to pass it down one day, just as it had been passed down to her. What she didn't know was that someone else saw the property very differently, not as history, not as family, not as legacy, but as opportunity. An opportunity has a way of changing people, especially when money enters the conversation. At first, the suggestions seemed harmless. Ethan occasionally mentioned selling. Rachel occasionally agreed. Nothing aggressive. Nothing suspicious. Just casual observations. Comments made during dinner. Conversations made during holidays. Passing remarks. Small enough to ignore. Repeated often enough to matter. You know that land could be worth a fortune someday. You could retire early. You could travel. You could live anywhere you wanted. Candace always smiled politely, then changed the subject, because the answer never changed. The land wasn't for sale. Not now. Not ever. And eventually, they stopped bringing it up. Or at least, they appeared to. Looking back later, Candace would realize something important. The most dangerous plans rarely begin with action. They begin with patience. They begin with observation. They begin with people quietly learning everything they need to know. Learning your habits, your routines, your weaknesses, your blind spots. And nobody knew Candace's blind spots better than the two people she trusted most. Her husband and her best friend. At the time, she believed that trust was her greatest strength. Months later, she would discover it was also her greatest vulnerability. Because while Candace was busy protecting the people she loved, someone else was quietly calculating how much her trust was worth. And the answer would eventually threaten everything she had built, everything she believed, and everyone she thought she knew. Candace didn't see the warning signs yet, not because they weren't there, because she had no reason to look for them. But that was about to change, because betrayal had already entered her life, quietly, patiently, and in the next chapter, the cracks would finally begin to appear. If betrayal announced itself loudly, very few people would ever become victims of it. But betrayal doesn't arrive wearing a warning label. It arrives disguised as normal, a missed phone call, a strange look, an explanation that technically makes sense, a conversation that ends a little too quickly, a smile that doesn't quite reach someone's eyes. And that was exactly how Ethan and Rachel got away with it for so long. Because Nothing they did looked suspicious on its own. It was only later, when Candace began connecting the pieces, that the picture finally emerged. And by then, the damage had already begun. The first moment happened on a warm Saturday afternoon. Rachel had stopped by unexpectedly, something she did often. Candace barely thought twice about it. Rachel had been part of their lives for nearly 2 decades. She knew where the spare key was. She knew Ethan's favorite coffee. She knew every birthday, every anniversary, every family story. By that point, she felt less like a friend and more like family. Candace was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she happened to glance through the window. Rachel and Ethan were standing near the back fence, talking. Neither of them noticed her at first. Then Ethan looked up, saw Candace, and everything changed. The conversation stopped instantly, not slowed, stopped. Rachel folded her arms. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets. Both of them suddenly looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. When they walked inside, their smiles seemed forced. "What were you two talking about?" Candace asked casually. Rachel laughed. "Oh, nothing important." Candace nodded. But something about Rachel's answer lingered. Because Rachel had always been a talker, the kind of person who shared everything. Yet suddenly, there was something she didn't want Candace to know. A few weeks later, they attended a neighborhood barbecue. Nothing unusual. Friends, food, music, children running through sprinklers, the smell of grilled burgers floating through the air, the sort of gathering where everyone knew everyone. Then Ethan told a joke, one Candace had never heard before anyone else reacted. Rachel burst into laughter, not because it was funny, because she already knew the punchline. Candace noticed it immediately. So did Ethan. Their eyes met for a split second. A look passed between them, then it disappeared. So quickly that anyone else would have missed it. But Candace didn't. She simply couldn't explain it. The entire ride home, she replayed that moment, trying to convince herself it meant nothing. Yet the feeling remained. Small, persistent, uncomfortable. Rachel became strangely interested in Candace's schedule. At first, it sounded harmless. When are you leaving? How long will you be gone? What hotel are you staying in? What time is your flight? Questions. Endless questions. One evening, Rachel casually asked, "So you'll be in Chicago the entire week?" Candace frowned. "The entire week?" "No, just 3 days." Rachel immediately corrected herself. "Oh, right. That's what I meant." But her smile looked strained. And for reasons Candace couldn't explain, that conversation stayed with her. Months later, she would remember every word, because it wasn't curiosity. It was planning. She just didn't know it yet. Ethan had never hidden his phone. For 15 years, never. Then suddenly, he started carrying it everywhere. Bathroom, garage, backyard, even to the mailbox. One evening, Candace reached for it by accident while clearing the dining table. Ethan reacted instantly. Too instantly. His hand shot across the table, grabbing the phone before she touched it. The room went silent. Neither of them spoke. Then Ethan forced a laugh. "Sorry. Work stuff." Work stuff. The phrase sounded reasonable, yet something felt wrong. Very wrong. Because people don't panic over ordinary messages. People panic over secrets. This was the first time Candace felt genuinely uneasy. Her grandmother had passed away 18 months earlier. The family land remained untouched. Nearly 60 acres outside Charlotte. Beautiful rolling property that had belonged to her family for generations. The place where she spent summers growing up, where her grandfather taught her how to fish, where her grandmother baked peach cobbler every Sunday afternoon. The land wasn't just property. It was family history. Candace had never considered selling it. Not once. Then suddenly, everyone seemed interested in it. First Ethan, then Rachel, then Ethan again. The conversations became frequent, almost rehearsed. You should think about selling. Property values are high. You could retire early. It just sits there doing nothing. The pressure was subtle, but constant, and Candace couldn't understand why they cared so much. The property had never mattered to either of them before. Why did it matter now? One evening, Candace was sorting through household mail. A bank envelope caught her attention. It wasn't one of their normal accounts. The statement belonged to Ethan. Only Ethan. Before she could open it, Ethan appeared, almost out of nowhere. His reaction startled her. "I'll take that." The words came too quickly. His hand moved immediately. Candace watched him slip the envelope into his briefcase. Without explanation, without discussion, without even looking at her. For the first time, she felt a genuine chill. Not fear, not suspicion, instinct. The quiet voice inside her that whispered, "Something isn't right." 2 months before the storm, Candace came home early. Migraine, terrible headache. The house appeared empty, or so she thought. Then she heard voices upstairs. Rachel and Ethan together inside the guest room. The door partially closed. Candace walked toward it. The conversation stopped. Immediately, she opened the door. Rachel looked startled. Ethan looked worse, almost frightened. "We were looking at vacation photos." Rachel answered too quickly. Candace looked around. No laptop, no photo albums, no phone, nothing. The room was practically empty, yet somehow she convinced herself the explanation made sense, because accepting the alternative felt impossible. Sometimes wisdom arrives from unexpected places. Candace's Aunt Loretta had always noticed things other people missed. One Sunday after church, she pulled Candace aside. "You okay?" Candace smiled. "Of course." Loretta studied her face carefully, then asked quietly, "You trust Rachel?" Candace laughed. "She's practically my sister." "And Ethan?" Candace smiled again. "More than anyone." Loretta nodded slowly, then said something Candace would never forget. "Be careful trusting people who benefit from your trust." Candace laughed it off. At the time, she thought her aunt was being dramatic. Months later, those words would haunt her, because they turned out to be the most important warning she ever received. 3 weeks before the storm, Candace and Ethan celebrated their anniversary. At least, they tried to. The dinner felt different, forced, awkward, disconnected. Ethan seemed distracted all night, checking his phone, watching the door, barely listening. Then, halfway through the meal, his phone vibrated. Candace watched his expression change, just slightly, but enough to tell her whoever had texted him mattered. A lot. Moments later, Ethan excused himself and disappeared outside. For nearly 20 minutes, when he returned, he smiled. But it wasn't the smile she remembered. And deep down, Candace realized she was starting to lose him. She just didn't know why. By summer's end, Candace had accumulated 100 tiny concerns, 100 tiny questions, 100 tiny moments. Yet she still couldn't see the truth, because the truth wasn't what she imagined. The truth wasn't an affair. The truth wasn't jealousy. The truth wasn't romance. The truth was greed. And greed can make people do terrible things, especially when millions of dollars are involved. And in just 3 weeks, Candace would discover the first piece of evidence. The clue Ethan and Rachel never intended for her to find. The clue that would transform suspicion into certainty. And once that happened, there would be no turning back. By this point, Candace had seen the changes, the late-night phone calls, the sudden secrecy, the conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room, the unexplained smiles, the growing distance. But like so many of us, she chose the explanation that hurt the least. Because accepting the truth would have meant accepting that her entire life might not be what it seemed. Before we continue, have you ever ignored a red flag because you trusted someone completely? Let us know in the comments. And if you're enjoying today's story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another NeuroTales story. Because what Candace discovers next is where this story stops being about suspicion and starts becoming something much darker. 3 weeks later, Candace found something she was never supposed to see. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. A single piece of paper, folded, forgotten, and hidden in a place no one would ever think to look. But that tiny discovery would become the first thread in a mystery that would eventually unravel everything, including her marriage. 3 weeks after Aunt Loretta's warning, Candace found something she was never supposed to see. Ironically, it happened because she was cleaning, not investigating, not snooping, not searching for secrets, just cleaning. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon, the kind of afternoon where the entire house seemed unusually still. Sunlight filtered through the living room windows. The air conditioning hummed softly. And for the first time in days, Candace had the house completely to herself. Ethan was at work. Rachel was supposedly meeting a client. Everything appeared normal. At least that's what Candace believed. Until she opened the drawer. The drawer sat inside Ethan's home office, a room he rarely used. Most days it remained empty. A desk, a bookshelf, a filing cabinet. Nothing unusual. Candace had simply decided to dust. That was all. Nothing more. She opened the bottom drawer, looking for furniture polish. Instead, she found a folded piece of paper. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. A printed document, folded twice. Tucked beneath an old notebook, Candace almost ignored it. Almost. Then, she noticed her own name and froze. Her heart skipped, just once. Hard. Slowly, she unfolded the paper. The first line read, "Beneficiary Amendment Request." Candace frowned. Beneficiary? Amendment? The words felt familiar, yet strangely out of place. She continued reading. Then, her stomach tightened, because beneath the heading, she saw Ethan's name. And beneath Ethan's name, she saw Rachel's. Not once, several times. The document referenced multiple accounts, insurance accounts, investment accounts, retirement funds. The paperwork wasn't complete. Several pages were missing, but one sentence stood out clearly. Primary beneficiary transfer pending approval. Candace stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Why would Rachel's name appear on financial documents connected to Ethan? Why would her best friend be listed anywhere? Nothing about it made sense. Maybe there was an explanation. There had to be, right? For several minutes, she simply sat there, reading the same page over and over, searching for a logical answer. But logic refused to cooperate. Because the document raised more questions than answers, and every question pointed in the same direction, toward secrecy, toward deception, toward something hidden, something she wasn't supposed to know. Eventually, she folded the paper. Every crease, every corner, exactly the way she found it. Then she carefully placed it back beneath the notebook. The drawer slid shut, but her mind refused to do the same. She walked downstairs, made herself a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out the window, trying to convince herself she was overreacting, trying to convince herself there was a perfectly innocent explanation, trying to convince herself that Rachel and Ethan hadn't betrayed her. The problem was, for the first time, she didn't believe her own excuses. That night, she barely slept. Ethan lay beside her, breathing steadily, peacefully, completely unaware she was staring into the darkness, thinking. The backyard conversation, the guest room, the phone, the bank statement, the travel questions, the property, Aunt Loretta. For the first time, they no longer felt unrelated. For the first time, they felt connected. Like puzzle pieces, waiting to form a picture. A picture Candace wasn't sure she wanted to see. The next morning, she made a decision. Not because she wanted answers, because she needed them. She would verify the document, quietly, without confrontation, without accusations, without alerting anyone, especially Ethan, and especially Rachel. If there was an innocent explanation, she would find it. If there wasn't, she would find that too. 2 days later, she visited the insurance company. Under the pretense of updating paperwork, the representative greeted her politely. Professional, helpful. Candace asked routine questions. Beneficiary information. Policy details. Contact updates. Normal questions. Then she casually asked, "Has there been any recent request to update beneficiary information on my policies?" The representative began typing. The keyboard clicked softly. Candace watched the screen reflected in the woman's glasses. Seconds passed. Then something happened. The representative hesitated, only briefly, but Candace noticed. "We received an inquiry several months ago." Candace's pulse quickened. An inquiry, not a completed change, but still. Someone had started the process. Someone had asked questions. Questions Candace herself had never asked. The representative continued. "It appears the inquiry originated from your husband's account access." The room suddenly felt smaller, hotter, heavier. Candace forced a smile, thanked the representative, finished the meeting, walked calmly back to her car, then sat behind the steering wheel for nearly 20 minutes, unable to move, unable to think, unable to explain away what she had just heard. Because, for the first time, there was proof. Not proof of everything, but proof that something was happening behind her back. That evening, Rachel called. The timing felt almost supernatural, as though she somehow knew, as though she could sense something changing. "Hey girl," Rachel sounded cheerful, relaxed, normal, too normal. Candace forced warmth into her voice. "Hey." They talked for 20 minutes. Work, weather, weekend plans. Nothing unusual. Then Rachel casually asked, "So, Ethan's still planning to keep the property?" Candace nearly dropped the phone. The property, again. Always the property. Always the inheritance. Always the land. Why? Why did Rachel care so much? Candace answered carefully. "I haven't really thought about it." Rachel laughed. "You should." Silence. A strange silence. The kind that feels heavier than words. Then Rachel added, "Sometimes opportunities don't come twice." Candace's grip tightened around the phone. Opportunities. Not memories. Not family history. Not legacy. Opportunities. The word bothered her deeply, because suddenly, Rachel wasn't talking like a friend. She was talking like an investor. That night, Candace opened a notebook. A simple spiral notebook she'd purchased years earlier. Nothing special, just paper. But that notebook would eventually change everything. She sat at the kitchen table, opened to the first page, and wrote things that don't make sense. Then she started listing everything. The phone, the property, the beneficiary document, the bank statement, the guest room, the travel questions, Rachel's sudden interest in her schedule. Everything, date by date, detail by detail, like a detective building a case. What Candace didn't know was that someone had already noticed her asking questions. Somewhere else in Charlotte, a conversation was taking place. A conversation involving Ethan, Rachel, and A third person, someone Candace had never met, someone connected to the property, someone connected to the documents, someone connected to the inheritance. And that third person was becoming nervous because for the first time, Candace Harper had stopped being predictable. And unpredictable people are dangerous, especially when they're getting close to the truth. Candace believed she had discovered the first clue. What she didn't realize was that she had just stepped into a game that started long before she found that document. A game involving money, land, greed, and a betrayal that stretched back much further than she could possibly imagine. For nearly a month, Candace lived two lives. The first was the life everyone could see. The smiling wife, the trusted friend, the successful professional, the woman who still attended dinners, still answered phone calls, still pretended everything was normal. The second life existed entirely in silence. It was the life of questions, the life of observation, the life of someone slowly realizing that the people closest to her were hiding something far bigger than she had imagined. And with every passing day, the evidence grew. The notebook on her kitchen table had become her secret companion. Every strange comment, every unusual phone call, every suspicious interaction, everything went into the notebook. Dates, times, locations, patterns. At first, the entries felt disconnected, random, meaningless, but eventually patterns began to emerge, and patterns tell stories. The first breakthrough happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Candace was reviewing notes from the previous month when she noticed something she had missed. Rachel always seemed to know when she would be traveling. Not eventually, immediately. Sometimes before Candace had even mentioned her plans publicly. The realization made her stop writing. How? How did Rachel always know? Then another memory surfaced. The guest room, the phone calls, the conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the property discussions. It all pointed toward communication. Frequent communication. Private communication. Communication happening without her knowledge. That evening, Candace decided to test a theory. A simple one. The next day, she called Rachel. Casually. Naturally. As if nothing had changed. During the conversation, she mentioned a fake business trip. A conference in Nashville, 3 weeks away. 4 days long. Completely fictional. Rachel reacted exactly as expected. Interested. Curious. Asking questions. The conversation ended. Candace waited. 3 days later, Ethan casually asked, "So how long is that Nashville trip again?" Candace froze. Only for a second, but long enough to know. Because she had never told Ethan. Not once. The trip didn't even exist. And suddenly, she knew Rachel had. For the first time, Candace stopped questioning herself. The problem wasn't her imagination. The problem was real, very real. 2 weeks later, another clue appeared. This one arrived accidentally. A mistake. A tiny mistake. The kind people make when they become overconfident. Ethan left his laptop open, only for a few minutes. But it was enough. Candace wasn't looking for secrets. At least, that's what she told herself. Then a notification appeared. A calendar notification. One line, one location, one name. Meeting Preston Development Group. Thursday, 2 p.m. Candace frowned. Preston Development Group. The name meant nothing. At first, then she remembered. 3 months earlier, someone had approached her about the family property. A representative, polite, professional, persistent. The company name had been on the business card, Preston Development Group. Her pulse quickened. Why would Ethan be meeting with developers? And why wouldn't he tell her? The property belonged to her family, not his, not Rachel's, hers. Yet somehow, both of them seemed unusually interested in it. That night, Candace searched the company online. The results made her uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. Preston Development Group specialized in acquiring large rural properties. Their projects routinely generated tens of millions of dollars. Luxury housing developments, commercial retail centers, private communities, massive profits. The kind of profits that made ordinary people do extraordinary things. Then she found the name that changed everything. Gregory Preston, founder and CEO, age 61, Charlotte businessman, real estate developer, multimillionaire, political donor, property investor, and, according to public records, a man with a long history of aggressive land acquisitions. Candace stared at his photograph. Something about him felt dangerous. Not criminal, not obviously, but dangerous. The kind of man who always got what he wanted, no matter what stood in the way. 3 days later, she saw him, not online, in person, and that was never supposed to happen. Candace had finished a late meeting downtown. The evening traffic crawled through Charlotte's business district. As she waited at a red light, she spotted Rachel, standing outside an upscale restaurant, not alone. Gregory Preston stood beside her, talking, laughing, comfortable, familiar, far too familiar. Candace immediately pulled into a nearby parking lot, heart racing, hands shaking, watching, waiting. Then a second figure appeared. Ethan, her husband, walking out of the restaurant, straight toward them. The three of them stood together, talking, smiling, like old friends, not strangers, not business associates, friends. Candace felt the world tilt, again, because Ethan had never mentioned Gregory Preston, not once. Rachel had never mentioned Gregory Preston, not once. Yet here they were, meeting privately, without her, discussing something. And Candace already knew exactly what that something was. The property. It had always been the property. For nearly 20 minutes, she watched. Then Gregory handed Ethan a folder, a thick folder, filled with paperwork. Ethan accepted it, shook Gregory's hand, and smiled. The sight made Candace physically ill, because whatever was inside that folder, they didn't want her to see it. That night, she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. The image replayed over and over. Ethan, Rachel, Gregory Preston, together, the missing piece. The third person, the person operating behind the curtain. The person neither Ethan nor Rachel had ever mentioned. And suddenly, everything made sense. Not completely, but enough. Enough to understand that the inheritance wasn't just a side issue. It wasn't just family land. It wasn't just money. It was the reason, the center of everything, the force connecting all three of them. And if Candace was right, then the betrayal had never been about love. It had always been about ownership. The next morning, Candace opened her notebook, turned to a fresh page, and wrote 3 names: Ethan Harper, Rachel Morgan, Gregory Preston. Then she drew a circle around all 3. For several seconds, she stared at the page, thinking, planning, connecting pieces, because, for the first time, she could finally see the shape of the conspiracy. Not the details, not yet, but the outline, and it terrified her. Because if Gregory Preston was involved, then this wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was business, and business can be far colder than love. End of section 5. Candace finally knows who the third person is. What she doesn't know is how long he's been involved, because the truth is far worse than she imagines. Gregory Preston didn't enter the story recently. He entered it years ago, long before Ethan, long before the inheritance, long before Candace ever realized she was being watched. And in the next chapter, Candace follows the money and discovers just how deep this conspiracy really goes. Candace Harper had spent most of her life believing that lies were revealed through words. She was wrong. The most dangerous lies are revealed through money, because money leaves footprints, records, transfers, signatures, timelines. And unlike people, money doesn't forget. 3 days after discovering Gregory Preston's connection to Ethan and Rachel, Candace made a decision. She would stop looking at behavior and start looking at finances. Because people could lie, bank accounts couldn't. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A rainy Monday evening, Ethan was in the shower. His phone sat charging on the kitchen counter. Candace wasn't interested in the phone. Not anymore. Phones held conversations. She needed something bigger. She needed proof. Real proof. The kind lawyers use. The kind judges believe. The kind that destroys excuses. Then she remembered something. A password. One Ethan had used for years. The same password he'd once used for their streaming account. The same password he'd used for their airline rewards. The same password he'd sworn he would never forget. Candace felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Slowly, she walked toward his home office, sat down, opened his laptop, and typed. The screen unlocked. On the first try, Candace stared, not because she felt victorious, because she felt sick. The ease of it somehow made everything worse, because it meant Ethan never imagined she'd investigate, never imagined she'd stop trusting him, never imagined she'd become dangerous. She opened his email. Nothing unusual. Work messages, receipts, newsletters, normal. Then she searched one word. Preston. The results appeared instantly. 37 emails. Candace's heart began pounding. 37. Not one, not two. 37. The earliest message dated back almost 2 years, nearly 6 months before her grandmother died. Candace stopped breathing. For a moment, then she opened the first email. The sender, Gregory Preston. Subject line, Property Development Opportunity. The message itself was polite, professional, short. But one sentence froze her completely. Once ownership transfers, we can move forward immediately. Ownership transfers. Transfers from whom? To whom? And why were they discussing her family property 2 years ago? Before she inherited anything, before there was even an inheritance, Candace opened another email, then another, and another. Every message made her blood run colder. Because Gregory Preston wasn't communicating with Ethan occasionally, he was communicating with him constantly, weekly, sometimes daily. Then she found Rachel. Rachel wasn't copied on every email, only the important ones. The private ones, the strategic ones, the ones discussing timelines, meetings, approvals, and contingency plans. Contingency plans. Candace stared at the phrase, reading it twice, 3 times. 4. Because contingency plans implied something terrifying. Planning, preparation, a long-term strategy. This wasn't an affair that accidentally evolved into betrayal. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake. This wasn't bad judgment. This was organized, deliberate, calculated. For the first time, Candace began wondering whether Rachel had ever truly been her friend, and that thought hurt more than anything she discovered so far. Then she found a spreadsheet, buried inside an email attachment. The file name seemed harmless. Development Projection Draft. Candace opened it and immediately wished she hadn't. The document projected future profits, projected sales, projected construction phases, projected investor returns, projected development revenue. And at the bottom, one number stood out. $48 million $700,000. Projected project value, nearly $50 million. Candace stared at the screen, unable to move, unable to process, unable to understand. Her family land, the property where her grandparents were buried, the property where she learned to ride horses, the property where her father taught her to fish, the property that carried generations of memories had become a number, a business opportunity, a financial target. And suddenly, everything made sense. Every conversation, every suggestion, every push to sell, every strange question, every secret meeting. The land wasn't sentimental to them. It was worth nearly $50 million. But the next discovery was worse, much worse. Candace found a folder, password protected. The title read, Acquisition Strategy. Her hands shook. Slowly, she opened it. The password was Gregory's company name. No creativity, no caution, just arrogance. Inside were dozens of documents, legal drafts, ownership structures, transfer projections, tax strategies, development maps, and one file labeled Harper's Succession Timeline. Candace opened it and felt the room spin. The document contained her name, her grandmother's name, Rachel's name, Ethan's name, Gregory Preston's name, all connected, all organized, all planned. The timeline stretched back nearly 3 years. 3 years before her grandmother passed away, before the inheritance process began, before Candace ever knew anything was happening. Then she saw the line she would never forget, the line that changed everything. Phase 3, influence, beneficiary decision through trusted relationships. Candace felt physically ill. Trusted relationships, not legal channels, not negotiations. Trusted relationships, meaning Rachel, meaning Ethan, meaning her marriage, meaning her friendship. For several seconds, she simply stared, unable to blink, unable to think, unable to breathe. Because suddenly, she understood. The inheritance wasn't the reason for the betrayal. The inheritance was the goal. The betrayal was the method. Every conversation, every holiday, every birthday, every dinner, every memory, every moment she'd spent trusting them had potentially been part of a strategy. A tear rolled down her face. Then another, not because of the money, because of the realization, the horrifying realization, that she no longer knew which memories were real. Were they ever genuine? Did Rachel ever actually love her as a friend? Did Ethan ever actually love her as a wife? Or had they simply learned to perform those roles? Candace closed the laptop, slowly, carefully, methodically, exactly the way she found it. Then she sat alone, in the dark, for nearly an hour, thinking, processing, grieving. Because grief isn't limited to death. Sometimes you grieve living people. Sometimes you grieve relationships. Sometimes you grieve the version of reality you thought existed. That night, she didn't write in her notebook for the first time because there was nothing left to investigate. The conspiracy was real. The betrayal was real. The danger was real. But one question remained unanswered. One enormous question. One question so disturbing she couldn't stop thinking about it. If Gregory Preston had been planning this for 3 years, who introduced him to Ethan? And more importantly, who introduced him to Rachel? Because someone had connected all three of them. Someone had started this. Someone had built the bridge. And Candace was about to discover that the answer lived much closer to home than she ever imagined. Candace finally understands the conspiracy, but she still doesn't know where it began. What she discovers next will be even more devastating, because The mastermind behind the entire scheme isn't Gregory Preston, and it isn't Rachel, and it isn't even Ethan. The person who started everything is someone Candace has loved her entire life. And in the next chapter, the past finally catches up with the present. For 3 days, Candace couldn't bring herself to open the notebook. Not because she was afraid of what she'd find, because she already knew. The betrayal was real. The conspiracy was real. The people she loved most had become strangers. And sometimes, accepting the truth requires mourning the life you thought you had. The 4th morning, she finally returned to the investigation. Coffee, notebook, laptop, kitchen table, the same place where she'd spent years planning family vacations, budgeting holiday expenses, writing birthday lists. Now it had become something else. A command center. A war room. Candace opened the acquisition documents again. This time she wasn't looking for evidence. She already had evidence. She was looking for beginnings. Because every conspiracy starts somewhere. Every betrayal has an origin. Every lie has a first lie. And she intended to find it. For hours she reviewed emails, meeting records, property proposals, corporate filings, public records, anything connected to Gregory Preston, anything connected to Ethan, anything connected to Rachel. Then she found something strange. A document dated nearly 4 years earlier. Older than everything else. Older than the inheritance. Older than the property discussions. Older than the secret meetings. The title seemed harmless. Community Development Initiative. Candace almost skipped it. Almost. Then she noticed a familiar name. Loretta Harper. Her aunt. Candace sat upright, reading more carefully. The document listed attendees from a charity fundraising event, business leaders, community members, developers, local organizations, and among them, Gregory Preston, Loretta Harper, and Rachel Morgan. Candace frowned. Rachel knew Gregory Preston 4 years ago? That couldn't be right. According to everything she'd uncovered, Gregory entered the picture recently, didn't he? She opened another document, then another, each one pulling a thread she never expected to find. 3 years before the inheritance, Rachel had attended multiple events connected to Gregory Preston. Fundraisers, networking functions, charity galas, business breakfasts, community projects. The realization hit her slowly. Then, all at once, Rachel hadn't met Gregory through Ethan. Ethan hadn't met Gregory through Rachel. Rachel knew Gregory first. Candace felt her stomach drop. Because that changed everything. The story she'd been telling herself suddenly collapsed. Gregory wasn't recruiting Rachel and Ethan. Rachel may have recruited them. The possibility was horrifying. Because it suggested planning. Years of planning. Not months. Years. Then she found the photograph. The single photograph that shattered what little certainty she still had. A charity gala. 5 years earlier. A luxury hotel ballroom. Hundreds of guests. Business leaders. Politicians. Developers. Socialites. The sort of event Candace hated attending. The sort of event Rachel loved. There they were. Rachel, Gregory Preston, standing together. Smiling for the camera. Comfortable. Familiar. Friends. The timestamp stunned her. 5 years ago. 3 years before Gregory ever appeared in Ethan's emails. 2 years before her grandmother became seriously ill. Years before anyone knew the property would become available. Candace felt cold. Very cold. Because suddenly, the timeline wasn't adding up. Unless Unless Rachel had known about the property long before everyone else. Rachel had spent 23 years listening to family stories, 23 years hearing Candace talk about the land, the inheritance, the history, the future. Rachel knew everything, every acre, every boundary, every family dispute, every legal detail, everything. And Gregory Preston specialized in acquiring valuable land. Candace slowly leaned back in her chair, a horrifying thought forming. A thought she desperately wanted to reject. What if Rachel had identified the opportunity years ago? What if Gregory wasn't the architect? What if Gregory was the investor? And what if Rachel was the one who built the entire plan? Candace immediately hated herself for thinking it, because Rachel wasn't just a friend. Rachel was family, or at least she had been. But evidence doesn't care about emotions. Evidence doesn't care about loyalty. Evidence doesn't care about memories. Evidence simply exists. Then came the second discovery, and this one hurt even more. A voice recording. Attached to an archived email, the file had been mislabeled, probably accidentally, probably forgotten. Candace clicked play. The recording quality was poor. Restaurant noise, silverware, conversations, background music. Then she heard Rachel's voice, clear, unmistakable. Candace froze. Rachel laughed, then said something that made Candace stop breathing. She trusts me more than anyone. Silence. Restaurant noise. A man's voice. Gregory Preston. Good. Then Rachel laughed again. A soft, confident laugh. You'd be amazed what people tell you when they think you're family. Candace felt physically ill. The recording continued. Gregory asked, "Do you think she'll ever sell willingly?" Rachel answered immediately. No. A pause. Then another sentence. A sentence Candace would hear in her nightmares. That's why we need Ethan. Candace slammed the laptop shut, her entire body trembling, heart racing, breathing uneven, tears streaming down her face. Not because she was shocked, not anymore, because she finally understood. Rachel wasn't caught in the conspiracy. Rachel created it. Rachel had spent years earning trust, years gathering information, years positioning herself, years preparing. And Ethan? Ethan wasn't the mastermind. He was the weapon. For the first time, Candace saw the truth clearly. Rachel Morgan hadn't betrayed her recently. Rachel Morgan had been betraying her for years. And somehow, that realization hurt even more than losing her marriage. Because marriages fail. People change. People drift apart. People make terrible decisions. But friendship, 23 years of friendship, that kind of betrayal reaches deeper. That kind of betrayal changes how you remember your entire life. Candace walked outside, sat alone on the back porch, and cried harder than she had cried since her grandmother's funeral. Not for Ethan, not for the property, not for the money, for Rachel, for the friendship she thought was real, for the memories she no longer trusted, for the years she could never get back. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, Candace made a decision, a final decision, a dangerous decision. She would stop gathering information and start preparing consequences, because the truth was no longer a mystery. The truth was a weapon, and Candace finally had enough of it to fight back. Candace now knows the shocking truth. Rachel Morgan wasn't recruited. She was the architect. But what Candace still doesn't know is how far Ethan was willing to go to make the plan succeed. Because hidden inside one final document is evidence of a betrayal so devastating. It will make everything discovered so far seem small. And in the next chapter, Candace learns what Ethan was prepared to sacrifice to secure the inheritance. By the time Candace Harper discovered Rachel was the architect, she thought she had already found the worst part. She was wrong, terribly wrong, because betrayal has layers, and every layer hides something darker beneath it. For several days, Candace did nothing, at least outwardly. She went to work, answered emails, attended meetings, cooked dinner, smiled when appropriate, laughed when expected, pretended everything was normal. Meanwhile, inside her mind, everything had changed. The woman sitting across from Ethan at the dinner table wasn't the same woman who had trusted him 3 weeks earlier. And the woman answering Rachel's phone calls wasn't the same woman who once considered her family. Candace had become an observer, quiet, patient, dangerous, because once trust dies, clarity arrives. 3 nights later, the final piece appeared, completely by accident. Ethan was asleep. His phone buzzed. Once, twice, then a third time. The screen illuminated the bedroom. Candace glanced toward it. A message preview appeared. Only 6 words. She still doesn't suspect anything. Candace froze. The sender's name made her blood run cold. Rachel. For several seconds, she simply stared, reading the words again, and again, and again. She still doesn't suspect anything, meaning whatever they were planning wasn't over. It was still happening, right now. Candace waited until Ethan fell deeper asleep, then quietly picked up the phone. The passcode hadn't changed, because arrogant people rarely believe they'll get caught. The message thread opened instantly, and what Candace found destroyed whatever remained of her marriage. Thousands of messages. Years of messages. Not months. Years. The oldest messages stretched back nearly 4 years. Candace felt her chest tighten. 4 years. 4 years of conversations. 4 years of lies. 4 years of planning. 4 years of pretending. Then she started reading, and every message felt like a knife. Rachel, she agreed to let me handle the paperwork. Ethan, perfect. Less questions that way. Rachel, you married the right woman. Candace stopped breathing. You married the right woman, not because they loved her, because she was useful. She wasn't a wife. She was access. She wasn't a partner. She was an opportunity. And suddenly, all those years of affection felt counterfeit. But the messages got worse, much worse. Candace continued scrolling, further back, further back, further back. Then she found the conversation, the one that changed everything. The date was 5 years old, several months before Ethan proposed. Rachel, the property stays in her family line. Gregory, then we need someone inside the family. Several minutes later, another message. Rachel, I may have someone. Attached beneath the message was a photograph. Ethan, Candace's hands started shaking. No, no, no. She zoomed in. Read every word. Twice. 3 times. 4. There was no misunderstanding. No confusion. No alternative explanation. Rachel introduced Ethan, not to Candace, to Gregory. Before Ethan ever entered her life, Candace felt physically ill because suddenly the entire relationship collapsed. The dates, the timelines, the messages, the planning, everything pointed toward one horrifying possibility. Ethan didn't accidentally become involved. Ethan was recruited. Years before she met him, years before she fell in love, years before she married him, the room felt smaller, harder to breathe, harder to think. Candace sat frozen, phone trembling in her hands. Because if that was true, then nothing was real. Not the proposal, not the wedding, not the anniversaries, not the promises, nothing. Everything she believed about her marriage suddenly looked different. The proposal, the timing, the relationship, the property discussions, the inheritance, all of it planned. The tears came immediately, fast, uncontrollable. Not because she missed Ethan, because she missed the life she thought she had. The life she now realized never existed. Then she found the final message, the message that pushed her past heartbreak, past grief, past sadness, into something else. Anger, pure anger. Rachel's message appeared near the top of the thread, only 3 days old. Once the transfer is complete, she won't matter anymore. Candace stared at the screen. 23 years of friendship, reduced to a sentence. A marriage, reduced to a sentence. A human being, reduced to a sentence. And for the first time, Candace stopped feeling like a victim, because victims react. Candace was about to act. Slowly, she put the phone back exactly where she found it. Then she walked downstairs, opened her notebook, turned to a fresh page, and wrote one sentence. They think I'm the target. They forgot I'm the owner. For several moments, she stared at the words. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. Not to Rachel, not to Ethan, to someone neither of them expected. A forensic attorney specializing in inheritance fraud. Because the investigation was over, the evidence was complete. The truth was undeniable, and now it was time to build the trap. Candace finally knows the truth. Rachel didn't steal her husband. Rachel helped choose him. And Ethan wasn't a victim of temptation. He was part of the plan from the beginning. But what Ethan and Rachel don't know is that Candace has stopped searching for answers and started preparing consequences. And in Section 9, the trap begins to close. The following Monday morning, Candace Harper walked into the downtown office of attorney Vanessa Caldwell, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't felt since the night of the storm. Control, not happiness. Not relief. Control. Vanessa Caldwell wasn't impressed by emotions. She was impressed by evidence, and Candace had brought plenty of it. The notebook, the emails, the recordings, the photographs, the financial projections, the beneficiary documents, the messages, everything. For nearly 3 hours, Vanessa reviewed every page, every file, every timeline, without interruption, without reaction, without giving away what she was thinking. Finally, she closed the last folder, removed her glasses, and looked directly at Candace. What you're describing isn't just betrayal. She paused. It's fraud. Candace felt her pulse quicken. Vanessa continued. Potential inheritance fraud, conspiracy, undue influence, and depending on intent, possibly criminal exposure. For the first time, someone else saw it. Not as heartbreak, not as a marriage problem, not as friendship drama, but as exactly what it was. A calculated scheme. Vanessa leaned forward. Do they know you know? Candace shook her head. No. Good. Vanessa smiled. Let's keep it that way. And that's when the trap began. Over the next 3 weeks, Candace became an actress. The performance of her life. She answered Rachel's calls, laughed at Ethan's jokes, attended dinners, hosted gatherings, pretended everything was normal. Meanwhile, Vanessa's team quietly worked behind the scenes. Subpoenas, property records, corporate filings, financial investigations, phone logs, everything. The deeper they dug, the uglier the truth became. Gregory Preston wasn't merely interested in the property. He had already secured investors, millions of dollars in investor commitments, money waiting for the land transfer, meaning the development project already existed. The roads, the blueprints, the financing, the permits, everything. The only thing missing was ownership, Candace. And according to the documents, Gregory expected ownership within 60 days. 60 days. The arrogance stunned Vanessa. They're acting like they've already won, she told Candace. Candace looked down at the report, then quietly replied, "That's because they think I trust them." Vanessa smiled. Excellent, because trust was about to become their biggest mistake. 1 week later, Rachel invited Candace to lunch. A small cafe near uptown Charlotte, the kind of place they'd visited together for years. Rachel seemed relaxed, comfortable, confident, too confident as they talked. Rachel eventually steered the conversation exactly where Candace expected. "The property. You've held on to that land for so long," Rachel said casually. Candace nodded. Rachel smiled. "You ever think about finally letting it go?" Candace pretended to think, then gave Rachel exactly what she wanted. Maybe. Rachel froze, only briefly, but Candace noticed. For the first time, Rachel looked excited. The reaction confirmed everything. That single word, maybe, had just accelerated the conspiracy. And Candace wanted it accelerated because the closer they got to the finish line, the harder they would fall. That evening, Rachel called Ethan. Ethan called Gregory, and Gregory immediately scheduled a meeting. Vanessa's investigators documented everything, every call, every meeting, every movement. For the first time, the hunters didn't realize they were being watched. 3 days later, the biggest mistake of all occurred. Gregory Preston sent an email, not realizing Ethan's account was already under legal review. Attached was a draft contract, the proposed transfer agreement. Candace opened the document, and her stomach dropped, because the agreement didn't simply discuss development. It discussed her. Specifically, one paragraph stood out, highlighted in yellow. Owner expected to rely heavily on recommendations from spouse and longtime family friend. Candace stared at the sentence. Spouse, family friend, not Ethan, not Rachel. Assets, tools, pieces on a chessboard. Vanessa looked at the document, then slowly smiled. They just handed us intent. Intent. The one thing fraud cases often struggle to prove, and Gregory had provided it himself. For the first time, Vanessa appeared genuinely excited, because now they had evidence, and motive, and planning, and intent. The entire case was beginning to lock into place. Meanwhile, Ethan and Rachel remained blissfully unaware. Planning celebrations, planning vacations, planning a future that would never happen. Candace watched them carefully, studied them, observed them, and something unexpected happened. The anger started fading, not because she forgave them, because she finally understood them. Greed had consumed them completely. They weren't winning. They were destroying themselves, and they couldn't even see it. The final stage of the trap arrived 2 weeks later. Gregory requested a private meeting, just him, Candace, and the property documents. No attorneys, no witnesses, no delays. He believed the deal was finally close. Candace agreed immediately. Vanessa nearly laughed when she heard. Perfect, she said. Let him talk. Candace nodded, because sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't discovered. It's volunteered. And Gregory Preston was about to walk directly into the trap he helped create. End of section 9. The trap is almost complete. Gregory believes victory is within reach. Rachel believes the property is finally theirs. Ethan believes Candace remains completely unaware. But in section 10, all three of them will discover the same thing. Candace Harper was never the weakest person in the room. She was simply the quietest. Gregory Preston believed he was walking into a negotiation. He wasn't. He was walking into an execution. Friday afternoon arrived warm and bright, the kind of beautiful autumn day that makes people feel optimistic. Gregory certainly felt optimistic. For him, this was the final step, the last signature, the last conversation, the last obstacle standing between him and nearly $50 million. At exactly 2 p.m., Candace entered a private conference room on the 26th floor of Preston Development Group. The room was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling glass, panoramic views of Charlotte. A polished walnut conference table worth more than most people's cars. Everything designed to communicate power, wealth, success, control. Gregory stood as she entered, smiling, confident, relaxed. A man who believed victory was already his. Candace. He extended his hand. It's wonderful to finally have this conversation. Candace smiled politely and shook his hand. For a moment, neither of them mentioned the property. Gregory offered coffee. She declined. He offered water. She declined. Then he sat, opened a leather portfolio, and placed a thick stack of documents on the table. The transfer agreement. There it was. Months of planning, years of manipulation, all reduced to a stack of paper. Gregory slid the documents toward her. We've prepared everything. He smiled. This really is the best outcome for everyone. Everyone. Candace almost laughed. Instead, she calmly opened the folder, pretending to read, pretending to consider, pretending she hadn't already seen every page. Gregory continued speaking. The future value, the economic opportunities, the community benefits, the development projections, the tax advantages, the investment returns. He sounded convincing. Very convincing. That's what made him dangerous. Because Gregory Preston didn't see himself as a villain. Villains rarely do. They see themselves as visionaries, people willing to do what others won't, people willing to sacrifice a few individuals for a greater outcome. Candace listened quietly, watching him, studying him. Then she asked the first question. When did you first meet Rachel Morgan? Gregory blinked, only briefly, but long enough. The smile weakened, just slightly. Rachel? He laughed lightly. Several years ago, I suppose. Candace nodded. And Ethan? Gregory leaned back. The confidence remained, but the comfort was disappearing. What does that have to do with anything? Candace closed the folder. Slowly, deliberately, everything changed. Because for the first time, Gregory realized this wasn't a negotiation. It was an interrogation. Candace reached into her handbag, removed a small folder, and slid it across the table. Gregory opened it. The first photograph. Rachel, Gregory, 5 years ago. The charity gala. The second photograph. The restaurant meeting. Gregory, Rachel, Ethan. The third document. The email chain. The fourth. The acquisition timeline. The fifth. The investor projections. The sixth. The message logs. Gregory's face slowly drained of color. For the first time all afternoon, he stopped talking. The silence was deafening. Candace finally spoke. You planned this for years. Gregory didn't answer. You targeted my family property. Silence. You used Rachel. Silence. You used Ethan. Silence. And you expected me to simply sign. Gregory swallowed hard. For the first time in years, Gregory Preston looked nervous. Then he made a mistake. A huge mistake. He became angry. Do you have any idea what's at stake here? Candace smiled. Because anger makes people careless. And careless people confess. Gregory stood abruptly. Do you know how much money has already been invested? Candace remained seated. 48 million projected, she replied. Gregory froze. Wrong answer. The exact wrong answer. Because only someone familiar with internal documents would know that number. and Gregory realized it. Immediately, his expression changed. Fear. Real fear. Because suddenly, he understood how much she knew. Everything. Every meeting. Every plan. Every lie. Every single thing. The conference room door opened. Gregory turned, and his world collapsed. Attorney Vanessa Caldwell entered first. 2 forensic investigators followed. Then, a representative from the state attorney general's office. And finally, 2 uniformed financial crimes investigators. Gregory's face turned white. Absolutely white. The room became silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, Vanessa calmly placed another folder on the table. A much larger folder. "This is a formal notice," she said, "regarding an ongoing fraud investigation." Gregory sat down, slowly. For the first time, the powerful developer looked very small, very human, very vulnerable. And the worst part? This wasn't even the end, because Gregory still didn't know what was happening across town. At that exact moment, Rachel Morgan was walking into a meeting she thought was routine, and Ethan Harper was receiving a phone call that would change his life forever. The trap had closed, but the real destruction was only beginning. End of section 10. Gregory Preston has finally fallen, but Candace isn't finished, because in section 11, Rachel and Ethan face consequences they never imagined. And the courtroom battle that follows will reveal one final secret. A secret hidden for years. A secret that changes everything. At exactly 3:17 p.m., Rachel Morgan's phone rang. She almost ignored it. Almost. She was sitting in her office reviewing a client presentation when she noticed the caller ID. Ethan. She smiled, expecting good news, expecting progress, expecting another step toward victory. Instead, the moment she answered, she heard panic, real panic. "Ethan?" No response, only heavy breathing. Then finally, his voice. "Something's wrong." Rachel sat upright. Immediately. "What happened?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Gregory." A pause. They got Gregory. The room suddenly felt smaller. "What do you mean they got Gregory?" Another pause. Then the sentence that changed everything. "Candace knows." Rachel froze. For several seconds. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Because there was only one thing worse than getting caught. Getting caught by someone you underestimated. And they had underestimated Candace Harper from the beginning. 23 years. 23 years of friendship. And Rachel had convinced herself she understood Candace completely. Predictable, trusting, emotional, easy to manipulate. She had been wrong, terribly wrong. Within an hour, everything began collapsing. Investors started calling Gregory's company. Attorneys started requesting records. Board members demanded explanations. Financial investigators seized documents. And somewhere in the middle of the chaos, Gregory Preston finally realized something. The land was gone. Not physically, legally. Because Vanessa Caldwell had already moved fast, aggressively, efficiently. The property had been placed inside a protected family trust. A move completed 48 hours earlier. Beyond Gregory's reach, beyond investor reach, beyond manipulation. The single most valuable asset in the entire conspiracy had disappeared. Legally, permanently. And Gregory's investors were furious. Because investors don't care about excuses. They care about outcomes. And the outcome looked catastrophic. Millions of dollars. Years of planning. Destroyed by one woman they never took seriously. Meanwhile, Rachel's situation was getting worse. Much worse. Because Vanessa's investigation uncovered something nobody expected. Tax records, hidden payments, consulting fees, wire transfers, money Gregory Preston had quietly routed through shell companies. Money that eventually found its way to Rachel. Not millions, but enough. Enough to prove coordination. Enough to prove involvement. Enough to destroy her defense. And when Rachel's attorney reviewed the evidence, he gave her advice she never expected to hear. Settle. Rachel stared at him. What? Settle. Immediately. For the first time in years. Rachel felt genuine fear. Because attorneys don't recommend surrender unless the situation is hopeless. And her situation looked hopeless. But Ethan's was even worse. Because unlike Rachel, Ethan had no money hidden away, no backup plan, no investors, no corporate protection, only consequences. The marriage was over. The property was gone. The conspiracy had collapsed. And now, he faced the possibility of civil liability. Everything he'd helped create was coming back toward him, fast. The first court hearing arrived 6 weeks later. Charlotte, Superior Court. Courtroom 4B. Every seat was filled. Reporters, observers, attorneys, business journalists. The Gregory Preston scandal had become local news, and everyone wanted to see what happened next. Candace entered quietly. No dramatic entrance, no celebration, no performance. Just dignity. The same dignity she'd carried through every stage of the betrayal. Rachel entered minutes later. The difference was striking. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the certainty. For the first time, Rachel looked tired, very tired, as though the weight of years had suddenly landed all at once. Then, Ethan entered, and Candace barely recognized him. The man looked defeated, older, smaller, broken. Not because he had lost, because he finally understood what he had thrown away. The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours. Evidence, documents, financial records, emails, recordings, timelines, one piece after another. The conspiracy slowly unfolded in public. Every lie, every secret, every manipulation, placed on the record for everyone to see. And then came the moment nobody expected. Rachel requested permission to speak. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge seemed surprised. Rachel stood slowly, her hands trembling. For several moments, she couldn't speak. Then finally, she looked directly at Candace, the woman she'd called her best friend, the woman she'd betrayed, the woman she'd nearly destroyed. And, for the first time, Rachel cried, real tears, not strategic tears, not performance, not manipulation, regret, pure regret. I'm sorry. The words barely escaped her lips. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I am sorry. The courtroom remained silent. Everyone waiting, watching, listening. Rachel lowered her head and continued. I kept telling myself it was business. Another tear. I kept telling myself nobody was getting hurt. A pause. But I was lying. She looked directly at Candace. You were the only real friend I ever had. Candace said nothing. Because some wounds are too deep for immediate answers. Some betrayals take years to understand. And some apologies arrive too late. The judge eventually recessed the hearing. People began leaving. Reporters rushed toward exits. Attorneys gathered documents. Court staff cleared the room. But one final revelation still remained. A revelation hidden inside Gregory Preston's records. A revelation nobody had discovered yet. Not Rachel. Not Ethan. Not even Candace. Because buried inside Gregory's private files was evidence proving that someone else had secretly benefited from the conspiracy. Someone much closer to Candace than anyone imagined. And, in the final chapter, The last secret finally comes to light. The final secret arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, almost 8 months after Candace Harper first discovered the conspiracy. 8 months after the storm. 8 months after the lies. 8 months after her life changed forever. Vanessa Caldwell called at 9:12 a.m. Her voice sounded different. Not urgent, not concerned, surprised. There's something you need to see. Candace immediately knew. This was the final piece. An hour later, she sat inside Vanessa's office. The same office where the trap had first been built. The same office where the fight had begun. Vanessa placed a thin folder on the desk. Compared to everything else, it looked insignificant, but appearances can be deceiving. "What is it?" Candace asked. Vanessa opened the folder, removed a single document, and slid it across the desk. Candace looked down, then froze. Because the name on the document wasn't Gregory Preston. It wasn't Rachel Morgan. It wasn't Ethan Harper. It was Aunt Loretta. Candace stared, certain she was reading it incorrectly. "No." Vanessa nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I said." For several moments, Candace couldn't speak. The document was nearly 6 years old, long before Gregory, long before Ethan, long before Rachel's involvement became clear. A land valuation report, commissioned privately by Aunt Loretta. Candace's heart pounded because suddenly the timeline changed. Again, Vanessa continued carefully. Loretta wasn't involved in the conspiracy. Candace looked up immediately. Vanessa shook her head. Not even close. She pointed to another page. A handwritten letter. A letter Loretta never mailed. A letter addressed to Candace. Candace unfolded it slowly, her hands trembling. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her aunt's. The letter read, "Candace, if you're reading this, it means I waited too long. There is something I should have told you years ago." Candace swallowed hard. Developers have been interested in this land for a long time, far longer than most people realize. Another line. "I had hoped our family would always remain united enough to protect it." Candace's eyes filled with tears. "But money changes people." A pause. Then, the sentence that hit hardest. "And sometimes the people we trust the most become the people we understand the least." Candace stopped reading for a moment because suddenly she could hear Aunt Loretta's voice. The wisdom, the caution, the quiet strength. Everything made sense. Loretta had seen the danger years ago, not the conspiracy. Human nature, greed, the temptation that money creates, the temptation that eventually consumed Rachel, consumed Ethan, consumed Gregory. Vanessa quietly handed her another document. This one changed everything. It was the trust agreement, the final version, the protected family trust. And buried inside it was a clause Candace had never noticed, a scholarship fund. The trust automatically allocated a portion of future land revenue toward educational opportunities for local students. Candace looked up, confused. Vanessa smiled. "You added that." Candace blinked. "What?" "You added it when we finalized the trust." Then Vanessa laughed softly. "You were so focused on protecting the property. You forgot you also protected the future." For the first time in months, Candace smiled. A real smile, because suddenly everything became clear. The land had never been about money. Not really. The land represented responsibility, legacy, stewardship, family, community, things Gregory Preston could never understand, things Rachel forgot, things Ethan sacrificed, and things Candace protected. 1 year later, the property looked exactly the same. The fields remained untouched. The trees remained standing. The old farmhouse remained where generations of Harpers had built memories. And every Saturday morning, a group of students arrived. College students, trade school students, young professionals, recipients of the Harper Legacy Scholarship. The first class included 14 students. By the second year, there were 27. By the third, 42. Lives changing, dreams growing, futures expanding. Not because someone sold the land, because someone protected it. One Saturday afternoon, Candace stood beneath an old oak tree, watching the students tour the property. Laughter filled the air. Possibility filled the air. Hope filled the air. And for the first time in years, peace filled the air. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Candace opened it. 3 words. I was wrong. No signature. No explanation. No name. But she knew. Rachel. Candace stared at the message. Then quietly deleted it. Not out of anger. Not out of bitterness. Because some chapters don't need responses. They need endings. She placed the phone back into her pocket, looked across the property, and smiled. Because the greatest victory wasn't winning. The greatest victory was refusing to become like the people who tried to destroy you. Rachel lost herself chasing money. Gregory lost himself chasing power. Ethan lost himself chasing opportunity. Candace found herself protecting something bigger than all 3. Character, purpose, legacy. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon, golden light stretching across the fields. And for the first time since the storm, Candace Harper felt truly wealthy. Not because of what she owned, because of what she refused to sell. End of section 12. The conspiracy is over. The betrayals are finished. The courtroom battles are behind her. But the lesson remains. Sometimes true wealth isn't measured by dollars. Sometimes true wealth is measured by what survives when everything else falls apart. And for Candace Harper, that wealth was never the land. It was the integrity she kept while everyone else lost theirs.
Candace's story reminds us that true wealth isn't about money. It's about integrity. Because when everything fell apart, she didn't lose herself trying to get revenge. She protected her values, her family's legacy, and her peace of mind. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think was the biggest betrayal in this story? And what does true wealth mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.